Okay, welcome to a short history of the world. I know in class already, hopefully, we have learned how to count, which hopefully makes some sense to you. As far as CE, BCE, counting the centuries, so that will really help when it comes to short history of the world because um, this is going to compartmentalize and it's really going to show you how everything that we talk about in class matters. So these are not necessarily events that are going to be on the exam, but knowing everything from this presentation, from this discussion, is going to be vital to you understanding how things work through this year. So the biggest thing that you have to get from short history of the world is the cause and effect of things in the world. So why does A cause B? So we're going to go over a lot of that in this discussion. And that's one of the big things that we have to talk about all year is connections, which we'll go over when we get to the textbook material. But connecting a familiar idea to an unfamiliar situation it's a hard skill. It's something that a lot of you have not had to do yet, but it is something we'll get into. So we will have a quiz on this. I'm sure I explained this in class about the quiz. So make sure you're getting your dates and your events down. So hopefully a lot of you recognize the comedy in the picture that's on the PowerPoint. It says Winston Churchill on the left and Hitler on the right. Needless to say, Churchill and the good guys won in World War II. So, alright, to begin with, now we're going to break this discussion down into eras of history. So on this slide we're going to go over real briefly what each one of those eras are. And then we're going to go through more detail in individual slides for those eras as well. So this is Stumpy. If I haven't mentioned him yet in class, he's a random accidental class mascot on a lot of the PowerPoints. I'll explain why later, don't worry, but you'll just see him randomly on almost every PowerPoint somehow, somewhere. Alright, so the first era of history, the ancient world. Now, it's about 12,000 BCE to 476 CE. So we say about 12,000 BCE because that's a long time ago. So we are not completely sure exactly when civilization started, but that's kind of what we're looking at. And then you see 476 is a very concrete end date. We'll talk about why a little bit later. So that is kind of our first era. So you see it's a big chunk of history and a chunk of years. Second era is Middle Ages, so 477 CE, 1453 CE. And again, that cuts off very distinctly in 1453, and we'll talk about why that is. But very important area. You see that's roughly about a 1,000 years, a little less. So next era, something a lot of you hopefully are somewhat familiar with, but we're going to go to centuries now. So 15th century, so Renaissance and Reformation, two very important kind of eras in history. Had a huge influence on what we do today, the Renaissance and the Reformation do. And then Age of Discovery, hopefully all of you, I think even in 2017, you all know the 1492 with Columbus and whatnot. So that is that era. So those are the events within there we're going to talk about. Now, 16th century, settling of the New World. So people are going to start to come into the New World because remember, it's kind of crazy to us to think about, but they had no idea the Americas existed. People in Europe, people in Asia. They were completely absent of it. Were there people in the Americas? Yeah, there definitely were. But they didn't interact with the people elsewhere in the globe. So kind of crazy idea. 17th century, so we have more settling, and then we have the Enlightenment. Hopefully a lot of you are familiar with some of the Enlightenment thinkers, or you've at least heard of it. And I hope some of you are like, Enlightenment? What is that? But we'll talk a lot about their impacts on the modern world too. No, 18th century, revolutions. Huge century when it comes to revolutions. Man, it's enormous. And it really impacts the entire globe. 19th century, so American Civil War. And then colonization of Africa. Very important. And you're going to notice I kind of mentioned this on the previous slide, how it's cause and effect. So a lot of the events in each of the centuries cause the events in the next century. So 20th century, lots of war. So two world wars, and even at the end of the 20th century, we're going to talk about a lot of the things that are impacting us today and carries over into the 21st century and the changing world, which is the world that we currently live in. Very, very, very different place, honestly, than a lot of the other eras of history. So we're going to, as I mentioned, go over each one of these individually in an individual slide. Some of them might even have two slides, but the cause and effect is key. Now you'll notice. So we're going to go through the history of the entire world in roughly 11 or 12 slides. So we're going to leave out a few things. And this is somewhat Western civilization centric. And if you're not familiar with that, it's kind of like Western Europe. So, United Kingdom, Ireland, France, Germany, Spain, eventually United States, Canada. It's a lot of the history that impacts us today, and you're going to see why we go over this whenever we get into the textbook material, because we're going to learn about space-time compression, globalization. You're going to understand then, hopefully you connect the dots on why this historical stuff really matters. So, again in review for your quiz, which I know we talked about in class, but for your quiz, you will get two events. You just have to pick the event that happened first. So make sure you're listening to our discussion here. Make sure you ask questions in class. Don't be afraid. Raise your hand. I mean, remember, everyone's doing, the work, so you don't have to worry about sounding stupid or anything. All right, so let's jump into a little bit more detail in each of these eras. Now, the birth of civilization is the ancient world. So this was, as I mentioned, the about 12,000 BCE to 476 CE. Alright, so let's see if anyone gets this. Now, 476, what century is that? So hopefully some of you are thinking 5th century CE, 5th century CE. Because remember, years 0 to 99, or my bad, there's no year 0, sorry. Years 1 to 99 are the 1st century, so 100 to 199 is the 2nd century. Anyway. So Mesopotamia. I'm guessing a lot of you are like, oh, we learned about this. I think it's ancient history in 6th grade, I think, maybe. So some of you might recall some of this. But this is called the Fertile Crescent. So this area right here. And you've probably heard of some of the civilizations within here. Now, we're not 100% sure exactly where the very, very first civilization was. But in order to civilize and settle, people needed to be able to grow food. Makes sense, right? Before that, we had hunters and gatherers, and you probably learned a little bit about them, wandering around looking for berries, or whatever, something to eat. But Sumer, maybe some of you heard that. Sumer, roughly around like right here. That is what we think the birth of civilization is, about 3200-ish BCE, but we think people started to settle around 12,000 BCE. I know that's a lot of crazy, interesting things to think about. Now, interesting tidbit, let's see if anyone kind of can get this on your own. So the first domesticated animal is also within the Fertile Crescent, which makes sense since that was the first area of civilization for people. So some of you might be thinking, oh, I know what animal kind of it is. It is the dog. Ah, God love dogs. So that's the 12,000 BCE marker, is a domestication of dogs and then people attempting to settle in one place. Now, some of these people you probably heard of, Mesopotamians, probably heard of, Assyrians maybe, they're really violent people. Phoenicians, so they were the people that came up with phonetics, so alphabet and whatnot, because they were one of the first people in recorded history to take boats and trade everywhere. And the Egyptians are also part of ancient world, birth of civilization, Fertile Crescent, kind of stretching out Mesopotamia type area. And I don't know if any of you noticed this yet, but rivers are hugely important. So the Tigris, Euphrates, the Nile River, all of those are hugely important to the first civilizations, because that's how they irrigated the crops, made food, etc. So now, think about this. So the Mesopotamians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, all those people. Do you think they were very advanced? No, right? Not to today's standards, but they were advanced to the standards back then, which makes them obviously modern in their time, which it's kind of weird for us to think about in 2017, right? All right, so when I talk about making connections between ideas, so here is a very, 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 very key connection. Now, the Mesopotamians kind of set it, or the people in the Fertile Crescent, I guess is a better way to phrase it. Um, they're the ones that set up civilizations on how people should live. Right? Make sense? So our next crew are the Greeks. Now, the Greeks took the ideas from the Mesopotamians and then they improved on them. See how that works? Roughly, they have a little bit of overlap on when they lived. I'm not concerned if you know the exact years the Mesopotamians and Fertile Crescent people started and then where the Greeks started. I'm not worried about that. Just know, and for these purposes, the Mesopotamians began before the Greeks. So, if you see anything Mesopotamian-wise, so Egypt is settled. Um, so on your quiz, so you see Egypt is settled, then you see Athens is settled. So that's a picture of the Parthenon in Athens in Greece. Um, so your answer should be Mesopotamians, or Egyptians, or Phoenicians. So any of those would come before the Greeks. Make sense? So the ancient Greeks, so they improve on the Mesopotamian ideas. So what they do is they're one of the smartest people in history. And in fact, we'll talk about this a few times. They are actually some of the people who invented some things that we are now reinventing today. I know that sounds really weird because they're thousands and thousands of years old. But the Greeks themselves were super smart. Did a couple interesting kind of like things on the side as far as like worshiping the gods, multiple gods, God for each city. Really interesting kind of religious background. But they were really sharp, and they actually invented a lot of the geography stuff. So yeah, they invented history too. Herodotus actually was the first one to write history books. But so that's the Parthenon. I already mentioned it. Now, still standing today. It's kind of beat up a little bit. I don't know if any of you have been to Athens, but it is a little rough. And that is on top of the Acropolis. So some of you may have learned that. And it stands in the middle of the city, so everyone can kind of see over it, protection, all kind of good stuff. So that's the Greeks. Now, the Romans are next. Now, quite often, you may even have encountered this in middle school. You hear the Greeks and the Romans like they're one group of people. They are not two distinct groups of people, but just like I mentioned before, the Mesopotamians. So Mesopotamians, Fertile Crescent people, they start things, the Greeks improve on them. Now the Greeks start other things, the Romans improve on them. See how that works? The Romans did a lot of great stuff. They had the Roman roads, if you ever learned about those. They used the soldiers to build them during peacetime. The Colosseum, right here, built 70 CE. And the crazy thing about the Colosseum, well, we think 70 CE roundabout. The crazy thing about that is it's still standing, and they still do things in there. I know it's a little rough if anyone's been to Rome, one of my favorite cities in the world. But we have a Colosseum, these days, and we built it. It's 20 years old, and we have to knock it down. So if any of you are familiar with like the Georgia Dome in Atlanta, the Falcons just got a brand new arena that actually might have been open by the time you hear this, and they knocked down the Georgia Dome because the Georgia Dome was like 20 years old, so might as well be ancient, right? But meanwhile, we have a couple thousand years old about the Colosseum still hanging out. So kind of amazing. So first slide, ancient world. The Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans, and Mesopotamians invent things, Greeks improve on them. Greeks invent things, Romans improve on them. So you see that? Now, we come to 476 CE. So that ends the ancient world. Now, someone might have an idea of what this is. Some people kind of do, some people don't. A lot of people were just caught off guard by this. Like, I had no idea. That is the year of the last Roman emperor. So I don't know if any of you know who that is, but that is Romulus Augustulus. What a great name, right? Not Caesar, not Augustus, Romulus Augustulus. So he's the last emperor of Rome, and he fled Rome. Reason being is there were Germanic tribes, they called them barbarians. They came in and sacked or destroyed a lot of the Roman cities. All right, so think about this. So you're a Roman citizen living in Rome or one of the other cities that they conquered, right? Because they conquered, half the known world back then. So you flee to the country because a lot of the people came and attacked the cities. So, since everyone moves to the country, they're not concerned with education too much anymore. So the Greeks, they made democracy. Everyone's education, learn. If you guys have ever heard of like the Socratic seminars where you kind of talk things through, all Greek stuff. Romans huge into education as well. You guys know they had republics, they had the Senate, they had other types of democracies as well. But now everyone leaves the cities and they move to the countries because the barbarians came in. And mind you, this didn't happen overnight, right? It took a while for these people to actually flee into the country. So this leads to our next era, which is the Middle Ages. And look at that cow. One thing about the Middle Ages, and this is pretty funny, this is how I describe it. People get stupid. So it used to be that in Rome, you're going around taking over cities, you're building schools, educating people, all that goes out the window. In the Middle Ages, their biggest thing is they just want to conquer people. A lot of people were illiterate back then. Even if you've ever heard of Charlemagne, conquered Western, Europe, unites it, all that kind of stuff, could not read. So, yeah, Charlemagne from France could not read. Interesting, right? And you see, that's a long, long, long time, 477 CE to 1453 CE. It's crazy, right? The fact that people weren't that smart in that era. And if any of you are familiar with like Robin Hood, that's this time period. That was with the Crusades. Crusades are interesting. We'll talk about them later on this year. You have Joan of Arc actually is going to help end this. If you ever heard this referred to as the Dark Ages, that's what this is as well. Medieval times. This is like kings and queens and princess and lords and knights. Everyone's like, oh, let me go visit a castle. Wasn't that glamorous? So if any of you were in love with this era, that's good. Historically, it's interesting. But yeah, people weren't real smart. I was in England this summer. And it's interesting, you go visit a lot of the castles, and some people are disappointed. They're like, oh, this is just a castle, but I think it's pretty interesting nonetheless. So you'll notice, similar to the end of the ancient world, we have the very exact date, 1453. That is the end of the 100 Years' War. So you may have learned about that one as well, which is a little bit longer than 100 years, but we won't talk about that right now. And that ends the Middle Ages. So, remember that 100 Years' War? That's Joan of Arc, all that kind of stuff. Ends the Middle Ages, so hopefully people are going to get smart again. It's always a positive, right? Now, welcome back, intelligence. So, 15th century, Renaissance, Reformation. Hugely important eras in the modern world. Now, you'll notice something. So we went from huge chunks, huge chunks, right? From ancient world and Middle Ages. Now we're going to century. So, someone might be thinking this. Anyone have any clue what happened? So that all of a sudden now we're going to learn about centuries, so 100 chunks, or 100 years at a time. So there was an invention. So it was the printing press. So the printing press, all of a sudden, now spreads information. So remember how Middle Ages, people were stupid, right? They forget everything, all that kind of stuff. But now, with the printing press, information can spread a lot faster. Think of it this way. The printing press was the social media of its time. Now, all of a sudden, you can get information instantaneously. So something happens in the world, we learn about it through, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. But back then, to them, instantly was, oh, I'm going to learn about it in a week because, someone's going to print a newsletter and then send it all over a kingdom or whatnot. So it's kind of funny for us to, again, think about this now. So it's funny to look back at history. But printing press is interesting because in the Middle Ages, even though people were stupid, there was one group that saved books. It was the monks. So the monks would save a whole bunch of books. So now in the Renaissance or Reformation, any of those books that we did have, we can reprint and kind of distribute throughout the world. Interesting, right? So because of the printing press, because of books, because of information, because of newsletters, just because of all that, people are going to become educated again. People are going to be able to read. People are then going to be able to spread news and ideas. So it makes sense. So cause and effect there again. Um, so now, first thing is the Renaissance. So it starts in Italy. Sometimes referred to as the Italian Renaissance for that reason. Now, hopefully some of you know Renaissance has a meaning. The word itself has a meaning. So Renaissance means rebirth. So you're like, rebirth? So what's being reborn? The ideas of the Greeks and the Romans are being reborn. So remember how I said the Romans and Greeks were really smart. They built on each other's ideas, democracies, education, things like that. So now, after that long 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, boom, now we have the Renaissance. Education's back. Intelligence is back. So they're like Michelangelo, Leonardo, all the Ninja Turtles, of course. And then you have a Northern Renaissance eventually later on. Some of you might be familiar with that. Huge with art, huge with religion. And the number one printed book of all time is the Bible. Again, because starting with this idea of printing press, Renaissance, big religious figures in art, all those different things. So interesting era. I took actually a class in college just on the Renaissance. Super, super, super interesting. All right, so 2 questions here. One, this statue. Sometimes people know this, sometimes they don't. Very, 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 very famous. If you go to Rome, Vatican City, you will see this now. It is called the Pietà, spelled Pi-T-A for us Americans. Michelangelo did that as a sculpture. So think about this now. That used to be one solid block of marble, and somehow he made this. I don't know how he did that. It's pretty impressive. If anyone's ever seen that in person, that's actually a picture of it in person. I took that. But it is impressive. So that's the kind of things they're doing there. If you ever heard the Sistine Chapel or any of those paintings, whatnot from the Renaissance, crazy good, crazy good. Now, a thing happened in the Renaissance that still impacts today, and it's called being a Renaissance man. Some of you may have seen this picture from Leonardo. Da Vinci made that because he tried to be a Renaissance man. So a lot of people in that era wanted to do that. And if none of you have ever heard, or some of you have never heard Renaissance man, that means it's a well-rounded individual. So to be a Renaissance man in the Renaissance, you had to be really good with art. You had to be a good athlete of some sort. You had to be able to read. You had to be educated in general in what they called the classics in history. So the ancient world type idea. You could, you're good at everything. Absolutely everything. So I say that impacts today. Think about this for a second. What today kind of encourages people to be Renaissance men or Renaissance people? Anyone thinking school? Because think about this, when you registered for Wando, you had to take a math, you had to take an English, you had to take a social studies, you had to take a science, you had to take an elective, you're eventually going to have to take foreign languages, especially a lot of you who are going on to 4-year schools, which should be every single person listening to this discussion right now. So we try to make you Renaissance people. Kind of interesting, right? So even to today, 2017, the idea of a well-rounded individual kind of breaks through there. So very, 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 very interesting and impactful to the modern world that we have. Now, the Reformation, the Reformation is another very, very, very important idea. So the Reformation is kind of connected to the Renaissance, kind of sometimes in a way. The Reformation, if you look at that root word, it says reform. So what are you reforming? So it's reforms on the church. So some of you may have learned about this at some point, the Reformation itself, which involves Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King. That mistakes happened before. But Martin Luther is a couple years older than Dr. King was. But we'll talk about this whenever we get to our religion unit as well. But really interesting kind of story in a nutshell. Martin Luther was actually part of the Catholic Church. He was a priest, worked in the church itself, was kind of disgruntled with the church. So, in essence, he wrote down 95 grievances or complaints he had with the Catholic Church. And then what he did was he went and nailed them on the church in Wittenberg in 1517. So, interestingly enough, if this was 100 years earlier, people would have read it and been like, oh yeah, yeah, we agree, we agree. And that's what people did. People went up and they was like, oh yeah, Luther's right. The church has done, this, this, and this. But it's interesting that in 1517, which I know is the 16th century, but we're jumping ahead a little bit, but it's impacted from the 15th, um, that people took that and they started copying it because now they have the printing press. So after they copied it, it goes around to other places in Europe. Then it gets copied and spreads and spreads and spreads and spreads and spread. So really interesting, right? And from there we get Protestants, and from there we get Lutherans, and from there we get Baptists, from there we get Anglicans eventually. So a lot of things came from the Renaissance and the Reformation. So there's still the impact through today. So very interesting. So Renaissance, rebirth of the Greeks and the Romans and thought, and then Reformation. What that is the reformation of the Church or the Catholic Church, and that actually creates Protestants because of Martin Luther. So very interesting stories. Now, Age of Discovery, also 15th century, but it's the very end, right? 1492. So keep this in mind. This always baffles me. So this part of the world, Europe, Northern Africa, had no clue that this part of the world existed. Crazy, right? Intelligent people, never thought the world was flat. Even the Greeks said that. We'll go over that when we get to our textbook information as well. But Columbus, his big mistake is, he sets sail right here, and he lands right here in what now, as we know, the West Indies or the Caribbean islands. He thought he was over here. So Columbus, who makes 3 big voyages, he dies thinking he found a shorter trip to Asia. No clue he was in a new part of the world. Kind of funny to think about again now. But Columbus, he kicks off a huge era that we call Age of Discovery, which now we have the 16th century. So settling of the New World. And some of you may have heard this phrase, but God, glory, and gold, those are the 3 big things that we connect to the Age of Discovery. So this picture kind of depicts them all, especially Spanish, Italians, Portuguese, big travelers, right? But you have God, see the priest? Glory was taking over this new land, and then hopefully there they would find riches and find gold. So this guy's just over here. This guy's just happy that he found land for once. So but I don't know if you guys have noticed it in the picture, but see this over here. So natives of these places, we're going to talk about how big of an impact that was. So Age of Discovery, they go around, find new places, but some of those places already had inhabitants, which turns into a few conflicts on down the road. But as far as keys to world history, to what's important to our class in AP Human Geography this year, the settling of the New World was the biggest event of that 16th century of the 1500s, because you just had more and more countries, more and more people trying to gain territory. So next, I'm sure you're catching on, is the 17th century counting. So 17th century, what number of years? Think. 1600s. Good job. Everyone got that right, right? Fantastic job. So, more settling. 1607, there's not often you're going to have to know exact dates, but here's a couple. So 1607 CE, Jamestown. First successful English settlement. Some of you may have heard some about Roanoke and places like that. A little interesting, but first successful settlement was Jamestown, current Virginia. They've actually kind of recreated that in colonial Williamsburg and some interesting places to visit if any of you have done so. But 1670, Charlestown is founded on the Ashley River. Oh, and some of you may have been to Charlestown Landing. I don't know if anyone takes field trips there anymore, but it's actually a really cool place. About 5 years ago, they redid it, and it's really nice. They even have like a zoo in there, and it's cool, pretty cool. So that was the original settling spot of Charleston. So you see, Charleston was settled not too far after the first successful English settlement, Jamestown. But the first European settlements that was successful in the New World was St. Augustine in Florida. I don't know if anyone ever heard of that one. But anyway, yeah, a lot more settling, 1600s. People were coming over here, people were settling, and then that's going to lead to the Enlightenment. So, think about this. Remember how we said you have the Renaissance, you have the Reformation. Now you start going all over the world, God, glory, and gold. People start asking questions. So people start saying, okay, now if the Catholic Church was doing some things that not everyone agreed with, and Martin Luther called them out, so what about government? Maybe they could be doing the same thing. They said we're going around taking over all these other people all over the world. Slavery is going to kick up to be even worse than it ever has been in history. It's always been a bad aspect of civilization, slavery has. But people were saying, well, wait now, governments are kind of taking people over. Maybe that's not right. So the Enlightenment is all about rocking the boat and all about asking why, asking questions, asking should we be doing X, Y, or Z. So super interesting era of history. Now, some of you may know Ben Franklin, one of my favorite people in history. He's one. John Locke, Rousseau, maybe some of those names you're familiar with. They're all Enlightenment thinkers. So that is the 17th century, 1600s. So more settling, know those dates, and then as people start rocking the boat. So, like I said, we have the Reformation. People start to question the church. Here, people start to question government. So 18th century, lo and behold, revolutions. See how that works? So since people started to question things, now people are going to start to try to overthrow governments. Now, kind of a key word. Some of you probably heard of revolution. You kind of understand the meaning. Some of you probably heard of the word rebellion. Kind of understand the meaning. Now, this isn't like written in stone, but historically speaking, throughout all of historical events and whatnot, a good rule of thumb: revolutions usually work. Rebellions usually do not work. So rebellions, people try to overthrow, attempt an overthrow of some group or person or government or something, and then a revolution, it actually does work. A rebellion usually gets squashed. That's kind of good general rule of thumb for you. So tons of revolutions during the 1700s, but we only want to talk about a few. So the first one, interesting now, this isn't necessarily overthrowing governments per se, but this is one of the most important events we're going to talk about. In fact, you're probably going to get sick of hearing about the Industrial Revolution over this year. We're going to talk about it over and over and over again. So, 1750s, it starts in Europe, specifically northern England, southern Scotland, which are actually one country, which we'll go over later. Don't worry, if we haven't mentioned that yet. I do want you to know the person and the invention that kind of kicked off the Industrial Revolution. So James Watt, maybe someone heard of him, kind of like Watt light bulbs and stuff like that ish. But he creates the steam engine. So the steam engine kind of kicks off the Industrial Revolution. Now the steam engine isn't the only thing in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is really a series of improvements that makes life easier. But this is an enormously important event because this does so many things. This gives people jobs. They can actually leave the farms and go into factories. This is going to spike population. We'll talk about why a little bit later, but it, kind of like in a nutshell, people have more time to invent other things. So they invent medicines, they invent newer ways to farm, better ways to farm. And child labor is actually a big part of this, hence the picture over here, which wasn't good, right? But it actually did create some child labor laws along the lines. Now you'll notice by these dates over here, Industrial Revolution starts in Europe first, the United States second. So it took roughly about 100 years because people started to have to migrate over to the U.S. and bring those Industrial Revolution ideas with them. And then the U.S. makes new inventions, all that kind of stuff. In fact, the U.S. Industrial Revolution, that created more farm machinery, where that didn't happen in Europe so much, but definitely in the U.S. that was enormous. And more food, right? More food equals more people. You'll hear me say that a lot later on this year. So Industrial Revolution, really big deal. New inventions, spikes population, people can get off the farms. Cool? Now, the American Revolution, you may have heard of this one. 1775, Battle of Lexington and Concord. So definitely something, hopefully, that you've heard of. Now, I've learned this over the years. So that's the Declaration of Independence on the right. I always ask you guys, when was the Declaration of Independence adopted, signed, all those kind of things. And it surprises me a lot of people do not know it's July 4th, 1776, and that's what the 4th of July is. There's so many people right now that just said, uh, so that's okay, all right. But the American Revolution is huge because it shows that someone can actually beat the British. So remember, the British were taking over all of those areas in the world, and they were one of the few places to have, multiple territories. But to be honest, even though as Americans were proud, revolution, go USA, that type of thing, if the British would have really concentrated on fighting, what will be the Americans, they probably would have won, but that's okay. And again, from the ironic part of the world, if any of you know anything with history and wars, the French were the reason why we won it. Because we actually used a lot of the French Navy, so all right. But this did prove that the British weren't invincible, and you're going to have other revolutions with the British after that. Now, the American Revolution, so cause and effect, right? That is going to lead and inspire, the French Revolution, 1789, storming of the Bastille, Bastille Day, if any of you were, know anything with French history and whatnot. The French Revolution, super interesting. If any of you are really interested in historical just events, things, maybe you're going to be a history major later on when you go to college. This is I think, one of the most interesting eras of all of history. They had the Reign of Terror with these guillotines. If anyone's ever heard of Robespierre, I mean, they would line people up in a town square and just one by one chop their heads off on the guillotine. And that was their way of sending a message to the population and said, hey, if you don't agree with us, look what's going to happen to you. I mean, wild, right? Can you imagine that today? And then Napoleon is at the end of this. Oh my gosh, he's super interesting, just his story alone. But the American Revolution did influence the French Revolution. And ironically, the American Revolution kind of worked and stayed, and the French, their leadership has gone back and forth in that era too, which is pretty interesting. So that's the 18th century. Now, 19th century, 1800s, American Civil War. So this has happened multiple places, but this shows that slavery will not be tolerated. So 1861, 1865. So important to kind of know that. Starts in at Fort Sumter. South wants slavery. North, obviously is anti-slavery, and slavery was. Alright, sorry, just had to redo the audio real quick, so this might sound a little different. But slavery was like a wheelbarrow that took all the other reasons to cause the Civil War. And a lot of it was states' rights, the idea of the South felt like a colony of the North because they would just have to pay them so much money. So American Civil War is significant, though, because just the impact of a very developed country at the time saying slavery is not right, we will not stand for this. And later on, that's going to impact other countries. So, next thing, on an opposite idea, colonization of Africa, which I'm not sure why we don't talk about this more often in history class, but this was enormous. So again, cause and effect, as a lot of countries are getting their own independence, so a lot of the Caribbean countries, the United States, in the last century, the Europeans, they went and decided they still wanted places to take over, which is crazy to us today. So they went into Africa. So as you see this map, it's very disturbing because they just carved Africa up into whatever the European countries wanted. So you see Belgium in the middle, the yellow one, they were one of the first ones. King Leopold, one of the biggest jerks in all of history. Over here, France, you can see it's kind of divided up a big section, but the whole place is just divided up amongst Europeans. So very impactful. And we'll say these countries are going to get their independence later on in the 1950s, so the 20th century. Now, you do see two gray countries here, Ethiopia on the right, Liberia on the left. They were never taken over. Ethiopia was never taken over because they were Christians, so the Europeans just didn't really, want to do anything to them. And then Liberia on the left was actually owned by the United States. So since the United States owned Liberia, no one really wanted to try to conquer them because for
obvious reasons, right? Because we know then all of a sudden it would be a couple issues if someone tried to take over U.S. territory while they were in Africa. So you can imagine why people did not do that. So, but again, the big thing is here is Europeans going into Africa and dividing up that area amongst themselves, and that caused problems up until today because they took small little tribes and they said, okay, you're all one country now. So a lot of these boundaries do look similar to the modern day countries. So hugely impactful and very disturbing as far as this whole era is. Trying to click. So next we have the modern age. So the modern age, 20th century, 1900s. So cars are going to be mass produced. This is huge. Henry Ford in the 1920s. So he made the old corny joke that the Model T Ford, the first Ford, could be any color you wanted as long as it was black. It's not very funny, is it? But this was a huge impact because now they can make things very efficiently and very quickly. So the mass assembly line, all of those things made things more affordable for people. So as cars are mass produced, this is going to lead to numerous other things in the 20th century. Now, World War I's next, 1914, 1918. Now, if you look at the map, it was the green countries versus the orange countries. Pretty sure you guys can guess who won. But World War I was, again, an enormous impact just because of the idea that the whole world was, in essence, at war. You see some of those great countries stayed out of it. We're not too concerned about that right now. But at the end of World War I actually helped cause World War II. Because some of you may have heard the reparations that the good guys put on the bad guys. So, in essence, U.S. and our allies, we told Germany they had to pay for the war. And that causes, in essence, World War II because Germany could not actually pay those reparations. And in between, in the U.S. and the rest of the world, they went into a depression. So this is when the Great Depression is going to happen. 1929 stock market crash, and then that's going to lead into World War II. So now World War II, 1939, 1945. We are not in it at the beginning, the United States, so similar to World War I. And this is, again, a direct result of World War I, World War II. So after Pearl Harbor, you guys probably heard of that, hopefully, happens, we have World War II. So again, all the green countries versus the blue countries. So we can guess, again, who won this war. But after this, the biggest thing is the U.S. becomes a world power. And the Cold War is next, which is 1991 ending. So it was the United States and Soviet Union, and we were the two big powers in the entire world. So the Cold War was not cold, nor really a war. So it was just a war of words. So it was us, both U.S. and Soviet Union, having nuclear weapons, and we were, in essence, would threaten each other. So it was a long period. Really, it was really 1950s until 1991. 1991 is when the Berlin Wall fell, officially ending the Cold War. That's also when the Soviet Union breaks up, and a country called Yugoslavia breaks up. So you see, the 20th century, a lot of war and a lot of conflict in here, but that's going to lead into what we're going to talk about with the 21st century. And you'll see what I mean, obviously, when we get there. But this kind of was an era of globalization so that we could see a lot of countries interacting with each other, although it was not a negative interaction, right? But during this era, too, kind of with Vietnam, the Korea War, if you ever heard of those were in the mid to late 1990s after World War II as well. Now, the 21st century, the world is changing, and it's changing, right? So the 2000s, and it's kind of crazy because we're already 17 years into the 21st century. It makes me feel old, but a lot of you know no other century. So you guys are just normal. But 9/11, I'm sure you could have seen this coming. That is our first big impact. And what this did, so remember how I said after World War II, the U.S. was a global power, us in the Soviet Union. So 9/11 showed that the U.S. wasn't the only power in the world, slash, we were not unstoppable. We'll talk about this in class a good bit, and we'll actually talk about it in Unit 1. But the extremist terrorist groups that attacked, their mission was to slow the U.S. down because they felt globalization was harming their extremist views of Islam. So their justification was, by slowing down the U.S. and globalization, they were actually helping their own religion. I know that doesn't compute a lot as far as, like, they were killing people and whatnot, but that was their complete belief. And 9/11 really shut down the world. To give you an idea, I'll mention this again later in other units, that no plane flights for a week, week and a half, 2 weeks, depends where you were. The NFL didn't play games on Sunday after 9/11. It was an enormous impact. That then, over the next few years, leads to the 2008 recession. So the recession, which impacted a ton of people, impacted me a good bit. I don't know if any of your families were impacted either, but I'll tell you guys, again, more about that later. But the recession was an economic recession in the world. So since the U.S. was such a world leader after 9/11, we kind of recovered a little bit, but then all of a sudden you see here, this is the stock market. So at the top of it was 14,000 right there. And then imagine in a few months span in 2008, it dropped all the way down to 8,500. So from the peak, it just plummeted down here. So really the 8,500 range is where it was. So that is half. So if you had $1 million in the stock market, well, simple math says you're going to lose 500,000 of those dollars. So kind of crazy to think about, right? So it took a lot of families and countries a really long time to actually recover from this whole recession. So we have recovered. Let me bring it up right now. So currently the stock market is at 21,454. So you see I was 14,000 before. Well, now we have actually bumped to the 21,000 range. So we have recovered since, but some countries are still struggling. Greece famously has been struggling in this recession. And then Italy struggled, some other European countries. And when less developed countries are also in this recession, they don't have anyone to buy their products. So it's not like the MDCs in the developed countries are the only ones that get impacted by this. Everyone else gets impacted as well. So some countries are out of the recession, some countries are out of the recession, but regardless, it has a very, very, very lasting impact into this 21st century that we currently live in. So, and again, a lot of it is due to the globalization. So it's cause and effect. So we always think of globalization as a positive thing, but it does have a few negatives as well, because one country gets impacted, all countries get impacted. So it's not just isolated anymore. But again, it never hurts to remind you, remember cause and effect. So everything happened in the 20th century is impacting us in the 21st century. So, World War I, World War II, we get all this power from the U.S. We have the Cold War with world powers. Boom, 9/11, so kind of slowing down westernization, globalization in the United States. 9/11 then impacts us over those 7-8 years into the recession. And then since this recession happened, we're still recovering from that. So cause and effect, cause and effect. So hopefully you guys are getting that with all this. Now, Arab Spring. So 2011, this does not get enough press, if you ask me. So this was phenomenal as far as globalization goes. So what this was an uprising by multiple countries. So these countries, it was their kind of citizens using social media in order to impact their own government. So it all started when in Tunisia up here, there was one guy who was a small merchant, and he was protesting the government because the government had taxed these small merchants, but they thought unfairly. So in a show of just, hey, we're not being treated fairly, they were protesting outside of a government building. While he set himself on fire, someone had a camera phone. With that camera phone, they recorded. So Facebook then spreads it all over Tunisia, and everyone else is like, yeah, let's get behind them. Well, people in Egypt see it. People in Egypt say, well, if this guy had this much impact, why don't we do the same thing? Libya sees it, Algeria sees it, Sudan, Morocco, all throughout this northern Africa and Middle East region. We have a lot of these revolts. We have civil wars. We have revolutions. We have protests, all because of social media. So it's very much a modern day revolution when we say that the actual social media had this big of an impact. So pretty cool, actually, when you think about it. Some of the countries did shut down social media altogether, shut down the internet, which is crazy. And there was some success in a lot of the countries, but not all successful. Egypt, ironically, was taken over by an even crazier group after they overthrew their leader. But we did have some positive moves, and this caused some of these countries to treat some of their people better, honestly, because some of them had some kind of corrupt governments. So Saddam Hussein obviously was in Iraq. If you guys ever heard of Gaddafi in Libya, but this helps actually lead to ISIS and the refugees, which is our last thing for short history of the world. So 2014 until the present, and hopefully you guys have heard a little bit about this. Refugees, someone fleeing for safety. So Syria right now has been taken over by ISIS, and I say that ISIS actually calls the country of Syria the Arab State or the Islamic State. So this has caused millions of people to leave. Millions of people. So 6.6 million people have been internally displaced, meaning they just had to leave their home and they're somewhere in Syria. They don't know what to do. Now this, you may have seen on the news, you have some people trying to float over to Europe to get away. You have, Iraq has 245,000 people. Turkey has 2.6 million refugees from Syria have fled to Turkey. Turkey can't even take care of their own people, let alone all the refugees. Lebanon has over 1 million people. Jordan, 637,000. These are all refugees from just Syria because of ISIS. So right now our big world problem is, how do we help these people? Because they obviously can't stay in their country. But the thing is, and we get, the answer a lot of times, let's just go bomb Syria. But if we do that, it's going to anger other people in Syria and the region, and then nuclear war happens. We don't want that to happen. So this is, if you ask me, it's one of our biggest current issues in the world. So what do we do with the crazies that are ISIS? What do we do with these poor people who are refugees who have nowhere else to go? And we'll talk about this again more in class, but that, my friends, is Short History of the World. So make sure you know your information for our quiz on Monday. And remember, you get 2 events. You have to pick the one that happened first. All right. Hope you learned something.